I'm Gail Sassnett, Director of the Bob Graham Center. We're so glad to see this great audience here tonight, and we are happy to have Professor Pippa Holloway with us. At the end, we will have time for audience Q&A, and we will have this microphone set up here in the middle of the aisle. We ask that you come to the microphone because we're streaming and recording, and your voice will not be picked up unless you are here at the microphone. So we need you to come here to ask your questions. Remember to please turn off your cell phones if you have not already done so. And now here is Dr. Bill Link, who is the Richard J. Milbauer Professor of History, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. Thank you, Gail. She mentioned my name is Bill Link. I'm in the Department of History here at UF. I'm very pleased to have Pippa Holloway here this evening. She is currently Professor of History at Middle Tennessee State University, where she's taught for nearly 2 decades. She's the author-editor of 3 books, including most recently this book up here, Naming and Infamy, Felon, Disenfranchisement, and the History of American Citizenship, which is really, I think, hands down the best book on the historical origins of felon disenfranchisement. I've known, on a personal level, I've known Pippa for more than 25 years, I think. Oh, yeah. First as a student, graduate student, I was a faculty member. So I'd like to take credit for her success. I don't know whether I can do that or not. Definitely. She's going to speak tonight on a very timely topic, very appropriate given what's going on in Florida right now. And I'll let you take questions afterwards, too. Yep.
Welcome, and thanks for your warm introductions. I'm super excited to be here for a bunch of reasons, partially to see my former graduate school professor, Dr. Link, also to meet the wonderful graduate students here at University of Florida, and to meet all of you. I'm going to talk for a little bit about my work, but I'm really interested also in your thoughts and your questions. So as I'm speaking, be thinking about what you're wondering and how what you'd like to know about my research and the current situation here in Florida. But thanks very much to the History Department for inviting me here, and in particular the Richard Milbauer Program of Southern History by Dr. Link. And also I'm grateful to the Bob Graham Center for Public Service for welcoming us to this beautiful space, and also to Aurelia Ebert, who's the graduate student that did my reservations and all my accommodation planning, and she's just been great to work with, so thank you. So I'm going to be talking about my research, which Dr. Link kindly said is the best book on the history of felon disenfranchisement in America. What he didn't point out is that's also the only book on the history of felon disenfranchisement in America, but we're just going to roll with that. I want to talk a little bit about the issue in the present, which I hope will convey to you the reasons that I decided to do this historical research, and then I'll talk about the history that I did, and then I'll finish up with a brief discussion of the current situation here in Florida today, with the ballot initiative and court cases, which I suspect many of you already know about. So it'll be sort of felon disenfranchisement, present, past, and then future. So let's start with the present. Felon disenfranchisement in the United States today. And I want to just say at the outset, you might think that I'm saying it wrong. Many people today say felon disenfranchisement. You can say either one, neither one is wrong. Historians, people in the past, said disfranchisement. And since historians deal in the past a lot, that's the term that I use. But people today often say disenfranchisement. So today in the United States, 6.1 million Americans can't vote because of a felony conviction. And this number is not only large, it's increased dramatically over the years. And you can see that starting in the 1970s, there's a growing increase that brings us up to the present number of about 6 million Americans disfranchised. Now, some of you are probably already knowing why this graph is increasing. Why is the number of people disfranchised for a prior conviction increasing over the past 20, 30 years? We also know about mass incarceration, right? Some of you that's read or familiar with the work of Michelle Alexander that talks about how the system of incarceration in the United States has really exploded over the past couple of decades. One of the collateral consequences of mass incarceration has been a concurrent rise in the number of people disfranchised, losing the right to vote for a prior conviction. So these things are obviously very much related. Who loses the right to vote due to a criminal conviction in the United States today? So in 2 states in America, nobody. In Maine and Vermont, you can vote even while you're in prison, which is an interesting thing to think about and something we'll discuss later, what the implications are for allowing prisoners to vote. In 2 states, you can vote as soon as you get, in 15 states, you can vote as soon as you get out of prison. So once you're out of incarceration, you are welcomed back automatically to be able to vote. In 4 states, you have to wait till you're off parole. In 18 states, you're disfranchised through prison, parole, and probation. And then there are 12 states in the United States in which disfranchisement follows you into the post-sentencing period. In 4 of those states, people are disfranchised. All convicted felons are disfranchised for life. Florida is going to fit into that category. I'll talk more about Florida specifically in a minute. But you can already see by looking at that list that Florida is in the strictest category, right? Florida has the largest implications for a felony conviction, and it's going to follow you out of jail, probation and parole, and into the post-sentencing era. So this means that 77% of disfranchised voters, if you can't vote due to a prior conviction, 77% of the time it's out in society. These are not people behind bars. These are people that are either on probation, parole, or in many cases completely done with court processes and are living lives like everybody else, but still excluded from the right to vote. Regional patterns. Probably don't have to spell this out. Does anyone see a regional pattern here? Is there a part of the United States where this is particularly a problem? Right? Southern states, right? The worst states, you see Florida up there on the top with 10.4% of people in Florida losing the right to vote due to a prior felony conviction. Mississippi, Kentucky, Virginia, Alabama, Tennessee, you're noticing a pattern here for sure. There's a couple west that are in there for some much more complicated reasons, but this is largely a southern phenomenon. And along with that, there's also some very distinct racial patterns and racial disparities in these laws. African American voters, 1 in 13 African American voters in the United States can't vote due to a prior felony conviction, whereas it's 1 in 56 non-black voters nationally. So nationally, there's definitely racial disparities. What this means is that nationally, 2.2 million African Americans, or 7.7% of black adults, are disfranchised compared to 1.8 of the non-African American population. So we're still talking about the U.S. as a whole here. But let's talk about Florida. So Florida, as you noticed, earlier graph is at the top, right? Florida is the #1 state with the highest rate of felony disfranchisement. Today in Florida, 1.68 million people were denied the right to vote due to a prior conviction, 1.48 million of whom have completed their sentences. So you can see a small number of people are still incarcerated. The bulk of them are done with their prison sentence and are living in communities. That's 10.3% of the voting population. And really, that last number is one that I just picked up before I came down here. 1/4 of all disfranchised felons in America. So if we got rid of felon disfranchisement in Florida, it would mean that in that entire nation, 1/4 of the people that are disfranchised could vote again. So Florida is a big part of this. It's probably the most important state in this regard. Why is Florida at the top of the list? Why is Florida the most significant state here? There's 2 reasons. In Florida today, a convicted felon can't vote, serve on a jury, hold public office, and until their rights have been restored. So if you have a felony conviction for the rest of your life, you can't do those things. The only way you can get those rights restored is through a petition to the governor for clemency. And I'll talk at the end about why that petition process, or how that petition process, has become so cumbersome that it only exists in a small number of cases. So Florida has both things. They have a strict law and a very difficult restoration process. And that's why Florida is so significant here. This is a little bit of detail. I'm not going to read all this, but I'll talk for just a second while you look at it. The clemency restoration process in Florida is very complicated and extensive. There's a 5-year waiting period. If during that 5-year waiting period you're arrested for a misdemeanor. So after you get out of jail and when you're done with probation and parole, you have to wait 5 years before you can apply for restoration. If anything happens during that 5 years, not even a conviction for a misdemeanor, an arrest for a misdemeanor, the clock resets. Depending on the crime, sometimes you have to wait 7 years, and then you have to apply to this clemency board for restoration. It's an extremely cumbersome process. If you had any number of things that can trigger that required application, and then there's almost a you can be denied restoration without any explanation and for basically arbitrary reasons. We'll talk more detail about this later, but I wanted to give you kind of an overview of why Florida is so important. And as a historian, we know that in order to understand often why the present is the way it is, making a plug for the historical profession and history majors here, why are things like this today? Well, let's look at how they were in the past and how we came to the present. And you can see also, to be another thing that we learned the reasons for in the past, Florida in particular has a racially disproportionate impact of these laws. In Florida, 23% of the African American population due to a prior felony conviction. I put a note on there about Hispanic voters in Florida. Hispanic voters are a large part, or Hispanic people are a large part of the Florida population, and they too are, of course, impacted by these laws. I spent a little time before my talk trying to get a handle on statistics about Hispanic voters. Apparently, the Florida Department of Correction doesn't count them very well, so it's really hard to get statistics about how these laws affect Hispanic voters because that population isn't very well accounted for in the prison and parole system. So that's still that's a topic we don't know that much about at present. We also know that these laws have a partisan impact, right? When we say partisan, we're talking about the political parties. Because African Americans are disproportionate Democrats, these laws, sorry, this computer suddenly, there it is. These laws have a particular impact on elections. You also know that Florida is a purple state. Elections tend to be pretty close here, and therefore when you disfranchise a significant part of the African American population, you're disfranchising a significant portion of the Democratic population, and this is going to affect Florida elections specifically. All right, that's your present. Now we're going to have the fun part in which we talk about history. So whose idea was this? Where do we laws? Laws that deny people certain rights of citizenship due to conviction or due to a prior criminal offense are actually quite old. They're certainly not invented in the They date back to ancient Greece and Rome, so they had this idea of citizenship. You don't have to know a lot about ancient Greece and Rome, but you probably know they had some of the first democratic processes, the first ideas of citizenship. And in these ancient democracies, if you committed a kind of terrible offense, you might be cast out of citizenship. These ideas of punishing criminals in part by being cast out continued in English common law and in continental European law. The main thing I want to communicate about this long past of these laws is that they were pretty rare. Often people that lost the right to vote were the most serious criminals in continental Europe, ancient law, and often these are people that committed capital offenses, so you're going to be executed. So voting was not even really an issue. So in those days, these laws applied to the worst criminals, usually people that were going to be executed, and it was a very small part of the population. Research shows that in the United States, before the Civil War, these laws were more common in southern states than northern states. And I figured basically by going through all the laws in all the states, or very nearly all the states, in this period from 1810 to about 1850, to see what their laws were about people being punished with losing the right to vote for a felony or for a criminal conviction. And this is a generalization. One of the things you learn to do as a historian is to make accurate generalizations. And my generalization is this was more common in the South. Most southern states had laws that said if you committed a serious crime, you lost the right to vote for the rest of your life. Northern states had these laws sometime, but they were often weaker. So they would say, oh, only the most serious crimes, only election offenses, only treason. That was more common in northern states. Some northern states then, as now, didn't have these at all. Maine and Vermont really never had these kind of punishments. And even in northern states in which they had these laws, they were often debated. People argued about them. People said, no, 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 this is a bad idea. So there was discussion, debate, and dissent over these laws. In the South, I found no evidence of that. Southern states adopted these in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. Strong laws without question. And Florida is an example of this. Florida's 1838 territorial constitution, which was the constitution that becomes the Constitution of the state of Florida in 1845 when it becomes a state, also the language in the 1855 Constitution, says that people shall be excluded from every office of honor, trust, and the right of suffrage, you get the point here, for anyone convicted of bribery, perjury, or other infamous crimes. So that's the law in Florida dating back to the beginning of the state and extending up to the Civil War, up to the end of the Civil War. You lose the right to vote, bribery, perjury, or an infamous crime. So the next thing research does, and probably the most significant contribution of my book, I think, is that I show that after 1865, Southern states expanded laws disenfranchising crimes. And they do it immediately after the Civil War, and they do it very explicitly to stop the newly enfranchised African Americans from voting. Remember, after the Civil War, African Americans get the right to vote. In the very first elections after the war, one of the first things that happens is felon disfranchisement. 1967 is the year of the first election after the war in which Southern vote to elect delegates to constitutional conventions. This is the first election in which the newly freed slaves can vote. And they have long, wordy PowerPoints, but I really need my words here. So forgive me for the next 2 slides. I'll read it out loud. In 1866, a group of white Democrats in North Carolina, got a typo in it, undertook a campaign of mass whippings of African American men to disfranchise them. An outraged U.S. Army officer witnessing this wrote to his superiors in Washington to explain the situation. White former rebels, he wrote, conspired to, quote, seize Negroes, procure convictions for petty offenses punishable at the whipping post, and then disqualify them forever from voting. In one county, he had heard reports that whites had already whipped over 60 men, and by next spring, they would have disfranchised all of them. This was due to the fact that in North Carolina, individuals whipped as a punishment for petty crime lose the right to vote. Many whites celebrated how the whipping campaign enabled to head off Congress from making Negroes voters. One legislator stated, "We are licking them in our part of the state, and if we keep on, we can lick them all by next year, and none of them can vote." I just want to take a deep think about what that quote means. It means that the first time African Americans try to walk up to the ballot box in North Carolina, not only are they told they can't vote, they're going to be whipped, right? The punishment that was given to enslaved people. They're going to be whipped for no reason, not even for a crime, like for trumped up charges and fake crimes. And then told that because of that punishment, they can't vote. Makes you think about the legacies of violence too. So like, what kind of, and the specific thing I get from that quote, and then I want you to continue to think about is, what political work does violence do? When the state commits violence against you, whether it's you, your family, a community that you're part of, what are the political implications? What does that mean for how you are able to function as a citizen? And for me, those quotes really give us a sense of where America has come from, and maybe even where we still are on the political work that violence does. Now, soon after these first elections in which felon disfranchisement is used to exclude voters, other disfranchising techniques follow. And these are ones you probably know about: literacy, poll taxes, the grandfather clause. My point, and what I prove with my research, is that felon disfranchisement was first. 1867, this is rolled out. Then, in the succeeding years, these other techniques that are used to deny voting rights are also part of the picture. And Florida is, again, back to Florida, this is again an example of exactly what happens in the rest of the South. One of the reasons I'm excited about talking about Florida is Florida's story really is the South's story in this regard. So in Florida's 1868 Constitution, there's black delegates and white delegates that are at this convention, and the job is to write the Constitution. And African American delegates there at this convention propose a broad suffrage provision. They basically say if you were a citizen of the state of Florida, you should get to vote. Not a lot of exceptions. But instead, the white majority of that convention adopted one of the most conservative suffrage provisions in the region. They implemented literacy tests that would go into place after 1880. They did legislative reapportionment, which basically diluted the African American vote. And then, for our purposes, most importantly, they expanded felon disfranchisement to include larceny and all felonies. Remember, the old Constitution said infamous crimes, right? 1868, they tack on felonies and larceny. That's a fancy word for theft. So Florida is the first state to sort of mysteriously, we don't really know why they're doing that, but they add theft to the list of reasons that you could lose the right to vote. Now, at the time, that meant only felony theft. So in 1868, when they said you could lose the right to vote for committing theft, we only meant serious felony thefts. Felony theft is theft of something expensive. Misdemeanor theft is theft of something cheap. So we're saying only serious felony loses the right to vote. This is due to the provisions in the first Reconstruction Admissions, which said that states could only disfranchise for felonies. So they said larceny, but because of the provisions of the first Reconstruction Act and the Readmission Act, we know that larceny in 1868 only means felony larcenies. So we don't really know what's going on here. Larcenies in there, serious larcenies. What I proved is that after 1874, states across the board lower the bar so that not only serious theft, not only theft of expensive things, but theft of minor things. The way you're doing it is wrong. Come up with something better. And so both the state of Florida and the plaintiffs that are suing the state of Florida kicked in those plans to the judge on February 12th. He's reviewing them right now. So watch the news. Probably in the next couple weeks, the judge is going to look at these proposals to change the system, and he's going to decide whether or not they represent a constitutional and useful improvement in the law. Probably at that point, it'll get appealed to a higher court. The judge seems to be on the side of making things better, right? He's not on the side of the existing law. The state's probably going to be upset about that and appeal it to a higher court. But then we've also got this ballot measure on the books in which you voters of Florida may change it all in November. So you see what I'm saying? There's two different things going on. There's a court case, there's a ballot initiative. They're complementary, but they're also distinct from each other. And so these are exciting times to be in Florida. They're exciting times to be a participant in civic processes in Florida. And so I want to hear what you think, what you're wondering about, what your reactions are to all this. And don't forget to speak into the microphone. But don't be intimidated by the microphone.
Who's first? Who has a question? Come on.
First, I'd just like to thank you for coming here and speaking. We really appreciate you coming and just speaking on the topic of disenfranchisement.
Thanks for being the first person to ask a question.
Oh, yeah, no problem. So in terms of like the opposite side, I'm just being devil's advocate here. What's the main proponent you've seen for the other side to like keep this disenfranchisement in Florida?
Yeah, great question, or even nationally. So probably and historically, the argument that's been made the most is that it's a kind of punishment, right? They say, you know, if you've committed a crime, you should be punished, and you should suffer the consequences of that. And certainly that's a pretty common idea, right? That people that commit crimes should be punished. And we also know as a country that that punishment is incarceration. It might even be probation and parole. But the question is losing your right to vote like part of that punishment or not? So some people say it's the kind of thing that should happen to you when you do a bad thing. That's definitely a position. Obviously, it's not something I agree with, but that's what they would. You asked what they argued, that's what they would argue. Some people also would say it's a deterrent, right? And that's really the ideology behind a lot of punishments, right? If people don't commit crimes because they know it's not going to be fun if they get caught, right? They're going to go to jail, they're going to have whatever happen. There's debates to the extent to which that really does function to prevent crime. Like, I'm not going to do this because I don't want to go to jail. But I don't think anyone has ever said, I'm not going to do this because I'm going to lose my voting rights. Like, I don't think it really works as a deterrent. There have been some people that argue that if you give former offenders the right to vote, if you give criminals the right to vote, they'll get rid of laws that punish people for crime. So they're like, maybe they'd be really soft on crime. But there's no evidence of that. Like, if you poll people that have prior convictions, they're actually harder on crime than bleeding heart liberals like me. They're like, lock them up, punish them. So there's no evidence that people that have prior convictions are going to, like, you know, if you've been convicted of burglary, you're going to vote to get rid of laws for larceny. Like, that doesn't happen. So those are the three main arguments: punishment, deterrence, and that they might vote as a block in some kind of way. Great question. Who's next? Come on. You get points for matching the book cover. Your shirt is like.
Thank you so much. If the question is not too big, can you talk a little bit about the transition in the South from the 1880s towards the present?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. One that I'm not particularly well prepared to answer. My work really stops in about 1920. The reason that I stopped it there is I don't think things change a lot after that. Two things are happening by the early 20th century in the South. These laws are still on the books, but for the most part in the South, people that can't vote because of poll taxes, literacy tests, and other things. So these laws are still there, but there's so many other barriers to voting in the South, I'm not sure they're having a tremendous impact. They're going to start being important again maybe after the Voting Rights Act is passed, so in the early 1960s. I think these laws, in the mid-1960s, these laws may again have an impact. But I'm going to turn that back to you. I don't know if you're a history major or not, but I think there's room for people to do a lot more research. Like, I stopped in 1920, so there's 1920 up till now that we need people to keep studying. So I don't have a lot of answers about that, but I hope other people, and maybe even some of you do.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here. Through your research, have you found any states that follow what Florida's proposing or the amendments proposing, in that sexual offenses and murder and people who are convicted of those would be indefinitely disenfranchised?
Oh, that's a good question. So there are a number of states that kind of make gradations in that regard. So where I live, Tennessee, for example, there are certain people with certain offenses can't get restored. In Virginia, for example, if you're convicted of what they consider a low-grade felony, your rights are automatically restored. If it's a high-grade felony, you have to jump through a certain number of hoops and petition the governor. So yeah, it's quite common. That's a great question. It's quite common for states to differentiate between classes of offenders and make restoration of voting rights easy for some classes of offenders and more difficult for other classes. That said, the idea of kind of writing them out in the Constitution has not happened since, like the 1860s, basically. So the idea that you would enshrine that disfranchisement in the Constitution forever, not give them any opportunities, you're committed a, murder when you're 16 years old and now you're 80, but still there's no mechanism for restoration. That's certainly more extreme than most states. So generally speaking, these reforms in Florida would put Florida more or less in line with other states by saying that once you're done with probation and parole, you can vote again. Excluding people with murders and felony sexual offenses is a little anomalous, but not completely so.
So, hi. So I'm going to make a comment, but then it's going to end up with a question. So, with respect to contemporary rights restoration, I think that a lot of people imagine that felons, they don't care. They got a lot of stuff to worry about, but they don't really care about this stuff. But the reality is, it for many is a very significant thing. Right? I mean, it contributes to their feeling of exclusion, the perpetuation of that, as they try and reinvent their lives, reintegrate. It's a big barrier. I guess my question for you is, you're looking at historical, you're doing a historical study. You're certainly looking at people who are advocating for the disfranchised. But to what extent do you see the disfranchised themselves really talking about the way that impacts them? Not just their ability to shape the outcome of an election, but how it impacts them as people and as citizens.
Yeah. I would refer you to Chapter 5, one of my favorite chapters, actually. So I'm going to start off with the first part of your comment, which is this common belief that people with prior convictions are not that interested in voting. A lot of people believe that. Actually, not really true. They basically vote, people with prior convictions vote like the rest of their demographic. So young people, unfortunately, but we hope you're turning this around, young people tend to not vote very much. So people with prior convictions that are young tend not to vote very much. As they get older, older people vote a lot. So they vote with their demographic, more or less. But your other question, your bigger question is, what does voting mean to people? And do I have historical evidence that talks about what voting means to people? And that's the chapter. I have a chapter on pardons and restorations in which I found a pretty great source base, about 3,000 petitions for reenfranchisement from people dating back to the Civil War era and into the 1920s. So these are people that in states that had these lifelong disfranchisement provisions were petitioning the governor or the legislature or the court or whatever the mechanism was in that state. And they literally wrote a petition. You had to write a thing out that says, my name is blank, and I've been convicted of this, and I would like the right to vote back. And you could do it as kind of a form letter, but a lot of people would kind of write their own, and they would add on there. And they would also have to get letters from friends and family members affirming their right to vote. And honestly, like, some of the stuff in there just gave me the chills. I mean, people would say things like, you know, it would mean so much to me that my children can look at me and know that I am an honest citizen. Some churches wanted the leadership in their churches to be voters. Some people would write about, you know, it pains me on election day to know that I'm not able to participate like other people are. People that were veterans often say, you know, sometimes I even found letters on behalf of veterans. They say, you know, this guy's a veteran. He lost an arm in World War I. We really think he should be able to vote. It just seems so unfair. The other thing I found in these sources that was really striking to me is petitions for re-enfranchisement from incredibly poor people, sharecroppers, tenant farmers, and these things were expensive. Like, you had to file a form, you had to file all these court fees. I'm looking at stuff from the 1880s in which people were paying $10, $15, $20 to get their voting rights back. That's a lot of money if you're a tenant farmer in 1880s Tennessee. So people were willing to make sacrifices to get their voting rights back, and they spoke really poignantly about what citizenship meant to them. And that, for me, like, that just opens up the whole question of voting. You know, what literacy taxes, what poll taxes would have meant to people? You know, all the ways in which people have historically been denied the right to vote. Yeah, you know, we like to say, oh, they couldn't participate in elections, you know, like, sure, but, like, there are all these other ways that, like, you're standing in a community, your sense of leadership in your family and in your town is really impacted by that. So thanks for asking me that. Step right up.
Sorry, I had to sit on this one for a little while. First off, thanks for coming. Talked about your work in one of my classes earlier today, so really excited to be here.
Wonderful.
So my question is kind of, I guess it's about age. How have you seen age play in as a factor, either with rates of incarceration, recidivism, or even restoration? I think especially after the onset of three strikes laws. Mm-hmm. How have you seen maybe the age, how that factor in?
Great question. A little overwhelming question, but I'll do my best. So I'm probably telling you stuff you already know, that age and incarceration rates are pretty correlated, right? Young people are more likely to commit crimes, be convicted of crimes, be incarcerated for crimes, and then these laws are going to, particularly in Florida, impact you forever, right? So these are laws that when you're 40 and 50 and 60 and 80 are still, under the present scheme, going to deny you the right to vote. So age is certainly a factor in that. In restorations, I don't have either historical or contemporary information about that now that I think about it. When I write historically about people seeking a restoration of their voting rights, I didn't get a lot of demographic data on age. It was primarily men, by the way, so gender is another issue here, right? Mm-hmm. So people that lose the right to vote in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s are all men. You start seeing women, actually, women with prior convictions asking for their voting rights back after 1920. So after the Women's Suffrage Amendment, my petitions start including women. So age, gender, I don't have any historical info, and I don't know if anyone's gathered contemporary demographic info on efforts for restoration. I would say, if this is something you're interested in digging into, the Hand v. Scott case has some beginning data on the number of restorations and some anecdotal descriptions of some of these restoration hearings they hold. And I don't know what that source base is, if it's publicly available, if you could maybe get information about people in the past 5, 10, 15 years seeking their voting rights back. That would be neat to see, but I don't know the answer.
Cool.
But I would say, you know, generally, like, this is a plea to all of you. Do research. There's so many questions. I mean, like, I'm kind of glad I can't answer some of these questions because I'm like, now y'all go do this. So figure out ways to design a study of that. That'd be a great thing to do.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Sure. Hi.
Hi. I just wanted to thank you for being here. But I don't know if you've done a lot of research on how being a felon affects employment opportunities. But I know that I'm a sociology major, so I've learned a lot about the culture of poverty and how having to put down that you have committed a felony perpetuates the cycle of poverty.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to know what you think policy change, like what implications policy change will have on that cycle and how it affects people when they have to put that down, and it kind of like puts them back into their, like it doesn't allow them to reinvent their life, in other words.
Yeah, that's a great question. So you're talking actually about this broader issue of collateral consequences, right? You commit a crime, you're convicted of it, you do your prison time or whatever, but then there's not just voting rights, as you're pointing out, other things that follow you, right? Including this ability to potentially get a job. There's actually, it happens in two ways. One is the one you're definitely talking about, is you apply for a job, and we've all done this. There's a box on there that says, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And if you have, then you have to say yes, right? But the other way that's a little more hidden is a lot of professional licenses. You're excluded from being a felon, from getting that license if you have a prior conviction. Medical licenses, lawyers' licenses, sometimes accountants. It really depends on the profession. This is actually a particular issue for people that are ex-felons that are trying to become lawyers, because lawyers you have to be an upstanding person. You have to be able to prove that you're morally upright and not going to break the law. Well, someone that convicted of a felony maybe decades earlier, there's a guy named Dwayne Betts who was featured in the New York Times a few months ago about this. He just graduated from Yale Law School, and they weren't going to let him become an attorney because he'd committed armed robbery when he was 16. So that's the big question. Your other question is, like, what kind of policy changes? Like, how do we fix this? Probably the coolest and most, not just coolest, but the most, I think, possible campaigns that have happened around this are these ban the box campaigns. Do you know about those?
Yeah.
So these are some cities and states, I'll tell everyone else, which is they say you have to take that question off the initial application form. So when someone applies for a job, you bring them in for an interview, and you don't know if they're an ex-offender or not. And only when they go to the next stage of the hiring process, if they say, yeah, you look qualified for this job, let's check your background, only then do you have to disclose. So basically, the idea is if you move that disclosure from the pre-application stage to the later in the stage, they can still say no if they don't want to hire someone with a prior conviction. But after they've met you, after they've given you a chance, they're not just saying we're not going to hire you. They're going because of, in advance, they're looking at you and saying, no, we've decided not to. So it makes that decision happen a little later. I think those are probably the best option for now. That's I tend to be a person that believes in, like, let's move the bar. Let's make things a little better. And ban the box isn't going to fix the problem, but it might make it a little better. And then maybe in a few years we can move it down a little further and push for an even bigger change. And I don't know what's the state of the law in Florida or in this county about that. Do you know?
I'm not sure about this county.
And there's not a ban the box thing in Florida, I suppose.
No.
Yeah.
But my next question, I just had like another
go
right off of that. Do you think that for states that don't have to ban the box, where it's up to the employer's discretion, do you think that overall decreasing felony disfranchisement will help with the stigma that employers have, and it'll make them choose to do that themselves?
Yeah, that's a great idea. I don't know, but I can see your point, though. I mean, what's neat today about Florida is I think people are saying, whoa, we've got this system in which people are being stigmatized for the rest of their lives due to a felony conviction. We weren't having these conversations 20 years ago. We weren't even really having these conversations 5 years ago. So I could see maybe, this is when I'm feeling hopeful, that, as we're all looking around us and we're saying, these are pretty intense laws that are maybe doing a lot of damage in people's lives with regard to voting, well, maybe it is going to get people thinking about other collateral consequences. We'll see how that plays out.
Thank you.
Great questions.
Is there one last question?
I see one more question.
All right, this will be our last question.
Hi. So I have a couple of questions. First, is this an American brand of democracy like disenfranchisement, or is it prevalent in other democracies similar to American democracy?
Very good question. I'll answer broadly and specifically. Broadly, America is really the only democracy that anyone's found that is making voting harder rather than easier. So almost every other country in the world that calls itself a democracy or has democratic processes works to make voting something more and more people can do, whether it's having widespread availability of IDs, of making the law clear and transparent, of encouraging people to vote. America's unique, really unique as far as I can tell, in moving in the other direction and making voting harder. With specific regard to felon disfranchisement, I know the most about laws in Europe. European countries, some of them had these laws for a while, but when the EU formed, one of the kind of rules for being in the EU was to follow European standards for voting in elections, and that included getting rid of laws not only disfranchising for prior convictions, but allowing people to vote in prison. So I know that in Europe today, even people that are incarcerated can vote in most elections. My understanding is that these laws don't really exist in other countries, but I don't know much beyond the United States and Europe, I'm afraid. I think most Latin America, I've looked at a little bit of information about Latin American countries, and I haven't seen anything like this in Latin America. Africa, Asia, I don't know anything about. The Middle East, I don't know much about voting laws in those places.
And today, has this not changed or been researched for many years because they were still upholding what they were trying to do in the 1850s, or just people just didn't think about changing what had already been done for hundreds of years?
Yeah, so there's definitely people have looked at these laws in an academic context. Legal scholars have looked at them, sociologists, political scientists. There was a little bit of historical research done before my book, but nothing like the kind of systematic study that I did. And there's a lot of history to write. I don't want to. I appreciate the sentiment behind your question, but I think it's really just a matter of historians not necessarily doing it, or historians focusing on other things. So historians wrote about literacy tests. They wrote about poll taxes. They wrote about disfranchisement generally, but not felon disfranchisement. Why? I honestly think that people didn't think the sources were available. I think they didn't think that these laws were very important in the 19th century. Most historians I spoke to said, well, poll taxes and literacy tests did the primary work of disfranchisement. Felony disfranchisement laws are kind of tacked on later. They weren't really used. So I was able to show through my research that they were used, they were important, and also not only were they important when they were implemented, they were important in the minds of people, and that they kind of did some cultural work as well as political work. So I think it's mostly that people hadn't thought about what the sources for the historical studies were and didn't think they were that important. And that's why I'm really hoping my book is like a starting point, right? So now that I've suggested some places to look, I've suggested some source bases, I've posed some questions, I'm hoping there's going to be more work, and there already has been some more work that's come out in response to my book, and I'm hoping there's much more.
Thank you.
Sure, great question.
Help me thank Professor Holloway.